The first body was never supposed to connect to the others, and that is where everything went wrong, because the pattern was visible long before anyone admitted it existed. And if you are watching this from anywhere in the world right now, pause for a second, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel, because this story depends on attention, memory, and the willingness to see what others ignored. And it begins with Daniel Harker, a mid-level FBI analyst who spent his nights staring at spreadsheets of death while convincing himself that the numbers were lying to him, because the official assumption was simple, comforting, and disastrously wrong, stating that serial killers escalated geographically, that they hunted close to home, and that unrelated murders spread across states were coincidence, not design. Yet Daniel noticed that the victims, though scattered, shared an identical silence. No forced entry, no witnesses, no recovered murder weapon, no forensic signature that screamed for headlines, only a recurring absence, and absence can be louder than evidence if you know how to listen, which Daniel did, because he grew up learning patterns the hard way, watching his mother disappear into routines that masked fear, watching his father deny danger until it was too late, and now he watched the Bureau repeat the same human error, trusting assumptions over anomalies. And the first anomaly was timing, because every victim vanished on a Tuesday night. Detail dismissed as statistical noise by supervisors who preferred clean theories to messy reality, yet Daniel kept counting, kept mapping, kept cross-referencing missing persons with unexplained deaths, and what emerged was not a line or a cluster but a rhythm, like footsteps echoing through different cities with the same measured pace. And the killer understood bureaucracy better than bloodlust, because he knew that jurisdictional borders were blindfolds, that databases did not speak unless forced, and that investigators were trained to hunt monsters, not systems. So he hid inside the gaps between agencies, leaving no signature except patience, and patience was misread as randomness, which allowed the murders to continue quietly, methodically, and without urgency, because urgency requires recognition, and recognition requires breaking an assumption. And the assumption was reinforced every time a task force disbanded, every time a case was labeled isolated, every time a grieving family was told there was no connection to pursue, and Daniel felt the weight of those decisions pressing against his chest as he built a private model on his laptop, feeding it dates, transit routes, employment records, and anonymized travel data, discovering that the killer never drove, never flew, never left a trace of movement that could be followed easily, because he used public systems designed for millions, blending into crowds that erased him by their size. And this was the second anomaly. The victims were chosen not for who they were but for where they would be when the city exhaled after work, standing at predictable intersections of habit, which meant the killer did not stalk people, he stalked schedules. And that distinction mattered, because it transformed the hunt from psychology to logistics, from profiling a mind to exposing a process. Yet the Bureau clung to the belief that motive created pattern, not efficiency, and efficiency terrified Daniel more than rage ever could, because rage makes mistakes while efficiency improves, and improvement was visible if you looked closely: shorter gaps between disappearances, cleaner exits, fewer digital footprints, suggesting learning, adaptation, and confidence. And confidence only grows when resistance is absent, when silence is mistaken for safety, and Daniel knew that if he was right, the next victim was already selected, not as a person, but as a point in time, a moment when thousands moved and no one looked twice. And he also knew that speaking up would cost him credibility, because challenging a foundational assumption inside the FBI was treated as disruption, not diligence. But the numbers did not care about hierarchy, and the dead did not care about office politics. And so Daniel prepared to step into a room where certainty was currency and doubt was weakness, carrying with him a pattern that everyone else had chosen not to see. What made the situation unbearable was that the killer exploited empathy, selecting victims whose disappearances generated limited media traction, people without advocates, people whose routines were invisible to anyone except a spreadsheet, and this strategic invisibility fed the assumption that nothing systematic was happening, because the public narrative prefers spectacle over subtraction, and subtraction was all that remained after each Tuesday passed. Another name removed from a list. Another family learning how fragile certainty truly is, while inside the bureau meetings ended with familiar phrases about resource allocation and statistical thresholds, language that sounded rational but functioned as a shield against accountability, and Daniel understood that the most dangerous lie is not spoken but institutionalized, repeated until it becomes background noise. And he watched colleagues, good people, accept that noise because accepting it meant sleeping at night, yet Daniel did not sleep, because once you see a pattern you cannot unsee it, and once you understand that a single assumption can outpace violence, you realize that evil does not always need brutality, it only needs permission to continue, and permission was being granted daily through inaction, through the comfort of precedent, through the belief that the past predicts the future, even when the future is being actively engineered to defy it. And as Daniel closed his laptop before sunrise, he knew the story was no longer about a killer alone, but about whether an institution built to protect could admit it had been wrong. He also knew that if he failed to force the pattern into daylight, the silence would persist, Tuesday after Tuesday, until absence became normal and normality became lethal, marking the true beginning of the tragedy that followed. Those 19 words mattered, because precision, like truth, depends on counting everything, especially what others overlook. Always, relentlessly, exactly. Daniel brought the pattern forward anyway, not because he believed the system would listen, but because silence had begun to feel like collaboration, and the moment he shared his findings with the Violent Crime Analysis Unit, the resistance was immediate, subtle, and professional, framed as concern for methodology rather than fear of implication, because admitting the existence of a cross-state serial killer meant admitting that dozens of investigations had failed to communicate, and failure on that scale demanded accountability, which institutions instinctively avoid, so the assumption was defended with calm voices and polished language, arguing that serial offenders require territorial familiarity, emotional anchors, and escalating violence, and since none of those markers were present, the deaths remained classified as unrelated incidents, yet Daniel's data showed something more unsettling, that the killer had reverse-engineered the FBI's own models, designing a process that deliberately violated expectations, spreading just wide enough to prevent task force formation, slowing just enough to avoid panic, and selecting victims whose routines were invisible to national statistics. And this realization reframed the entire threat, because it suggested intelligence rather than impulse, intention rather than compulsion, and strategy rather than sickness. And strategy does not burn itself out. It optimizes, and optimization was exactly what the timeline demonstrated, showing reduced exposure windows and increasing precision, meaning the killer was learning from every successful disappearance, refining technique without ever appearing on a suspect list, because there was no list to begin with, and the Bureau's reliance on legacy assumptions became the shield behind which the violence flourished, allowing the murderer to exploit the blind spots created by specialization, because each local office saw only fragments, and fragments never trigger alarms. Patterns do, yet patterns require aggregation, and aggregation was dismissed as overreach. And as weeks passed, Daniel watched new names appear, each one fitting perfectly into the model, each one reinforcing the dread that the killer was ahead of them not by luck but by design. And the most disturbing element was predictability, because the next event could be forecast within a 2-hour window. A Tuesday evening between 7:12 and 9:47, near transit nodes where crowd density dissolved individuality, and Daniel understood that if the pattern held, the killer was not choosing victims randomly but selecting moments of maximum anonymity, moments where help was statistically unlikely, moments when attention was elsewhere, and this knowledge created a moral weight that no clearance level could mitigate, because knowing when someone might vanish and failing to stop it is a burden that corrodes the soul. And Daniel felt that corrosion deepen as his warnings were logged, reviewed, and deferred, categorized as interesting but unproven, compelling but insufficient, because certainty is demanded before action, even when action is the only path to certainty, and so the murders continued under the protection of procedural caution, while the killer adjusted routes, changed entry points, and refined exit strategies, always one step ahead of an institution moving at the speed of paperwork. And what terrified Daniel most was not the killer's efficiency but his patience, because patience implies confidence, and confidence implies confirmation, meaning the killer knew the assumption would hold, knew the pattern would be ignored, and knew that every successful act reinforced institutional denial, creating a feedback loop where inaction became justification for more inaction. And as the list of victims grew, Daniel began to recognize a deeper failure, one rooted not in incompetence but in belief, because the FBI believed serial killers were driven by compulsion that inevitably betrayed them, yet this offender was driven by control, and control thrives in silence, and silence was abundant, especially for victims who existed on the margins of attention, whose absences did not disrupt political calendars or news cycles. And this selective targeting was not incidental, it was operational, reducing risk while increasing longevity, ensuring the pattern remained visible only to those willing to question foundational truths, and Daniel was increasingly alone in that willingness, isolated not by hostility but by indifference, the most corrosive force in any system, because indifference allows harm to continue without resistance. And as he refined his model further, he discovered a chilling possibility that the killer was monitoring public data releases, adjusting behavior based on which cases received media exposure, effectively crowdsourcing invisibility, letting public attention guide avoidance. And this meant the killer was not just exploiting assumptions, but actively shaping them, reinforcing the narrative of randomness by retreating whenever scrutiny intensified, then resuming once attention faded, and this adaptive behavior placed the threat beyond traditional profiling, demanding a shift from psychological interpretation to systemic disruption, yet such a shift required leadership willing to admit that their frameworks were outdated, and that admission never came, leaving Daniel with a terrible clarity that the greatest obstacle to stopping the killings was not lack of evidence but loyalty to belief, and belief, once institutionalized, becomes immovable even when bodies accumulate beneath it. And so the killer continued, protected not by darkness but by daylight, not by chaos but by order, not by madness but by assumption, while Daniel counted Tuesdays, knowing each one represented a failure that could have been prevented if the pattern had been allowed to speak. The numbers never lied, only the faith placed against them did. The break did not come from the FBI, and that was the most damning detail of all, because it arrived from a municipal transit authority audit, a routine budget review that flagged nothing criminal yet revealed everything operational, and Daniel almost missed it because it was buried inside procurement language, but the numbers aligned with his model too precisely to ignore, showing repeated maintenance requests at stations near the predicted windows, requests triggered not by damage but by sensor anomalies that occurred briefly and then vanished. And when Daniel overlaid those timestamps with his disappearance timeline, the alignment was exact, down to the minute, suggesting the killer had discovered how to temporarily disrupt surveillance without triggering alerts, not through hacking but through physical interference so minor it registered as routine malfunction, which meant the killer understood infrastructure as well as behavior, exploiting complexity rather than force, and this revelation reframed the murders again, proving the offender was not simply patient but educated, capable of studying public systems and manipulating them invisibly, and this should have changed everything, yet when Daniel escalated the finding it was absorbed into another review cycle, another committee, another postponement, because acknowledging the implication meant admitting that public safety systems themselves were being weaponized, a truth too unsettling to confront quickly, and so the assumption persisted that no single offender could operate across jurisdictions with such precision, even as evidence accumulated that someone already had, and Daniel felt something break inside him, a realization that the institution he served was structurally incapable of seeing threats that did not match precedent, because precedent is comforting, predictable, and defensible, while novelty is dangerous, expensive, and politically risky, and so the murders were allowed to continue under the guise of prudence, while the killer refined his process further, shortening exposure times, selecting transit nodes with layered redundancies, ensuring that even if one camera captured something, another failure would erase context, and this cascading ambiguity was intentional, because ambiguity kills momentum, and momentum is the only force that overcomes bureaucracy, and Daniel understood now that the killer's true weapon was not violence but understanding, an understanding of how institutions protect themselves from embarrassment before they protect the public, and this knowledge created a chilling symmetry, because Daniel too understood the system, and yet that understanding left him powerless, trapped between duty and futility, watching the pattern expand while official narratives shrank to preserve coherence. And as another Tuesday approached, Daniel did something he had resisted. He acted without authorization, sharing a redacted version of his model with a state investigator named Marcus Vale, someone outside the federal hierarchy, someone whose jurisdiction had lost 2 victims already, and Marcus listened, not because he believed the model immediately, but because he recognized the weight in Daniel's voice, the sound of someone who had run out of sanctioned options, and that conversation mattered, because it created the first crack in the assumption, the first moment where the pattern was acknowledged as possibility rather than nuisance, and Marcus began quietly adjusting patrol schedules near predicted windows, not enough to raise alarms, just enough to test the theory, and when nothing happened the first Tuesday, Daniel felt relief that quickly turned to dread, because absence could mean deterrence or adjustment, and adjustment was more likely, and the following week the disappearance occurred earlier, outside the previous window but still within the broader model, confirming that the killer was responsive, observant, and adaptive, meaning the threat was escalating, not in violence but in intelligence, and this confirmed Daniel's fear that the killer was monitoring behavior changes, learning from resistance, and that partial measures only educated the offender further, making eventual capture more difficult. And when Daniel reported this development internally, it was reframed as proof of randomness, an argument that the shifting timeline invalidated the model, rather than confirming it, and this circular logic protected the assumption perfectly, because any evidence that contradicted it was used to reinforce it, and Daniel realized that the institution had become self-sealing, incapable of falsification, and therefore incapable of learning, and in that moment he understood the true cost of the original assumption, that it did not merely delay action. It actively trained the killer by providing a stable environment in which to experiment, refine, and perfect, turning investigative inertia into an unwitting collaborator, and this collaboration was invisible, unintentional, and devastating, because it allowed the murders to continue not in spite of law enforcement but alongside it, shielded by process, and Daniel knew then that stopping the killings would require breaking the assumption publicly, violently if necessary, not with force but with undeniable exposure, even if that exposure destroyed careers, reputations, and the illusion of control that leadership clung to, because the alternative was unthinkable, a future where efficiency replaced empathy, where invisibility became protection, and where the dead accumulated quietly beneath a belief no one dared to question. Daniel's decision to move beyond the bureau did not come from rebellion but from inevitability, because once you understand that a system is structurally incapable of correcting itself, loyalty becomes a form of harm, and he could no longer pretend that patience was virtue when it functioned as permission. So, he began building something parallel, informal, and dangerously effective. A quiet network of local investigators, transit supervisors, emergency dispatch analysts, and data technicians, who were tired of waiting for authority to catch up with reality, and this network operated without titles or press releases, bound only by shared access to fragments that the FBI refused to assemble, and as these fragments merged, the pattern sharpened into something undeniable, revealing that the killer was not merely exploiting public transit but synchronizing across cities using federally standardized schedules, meaning the same structural uniformity designed to keep the country moving. Efficiently was being inverted into a killing machine, and this inversion was brilliant in its simplicity, because uniformity creates predictability, and predictability can be timed, and Daniel saw now that the original assumption, that killers cling to familiarity, had blinded the Bureau to the truth that familiarity had gone national, standardized, exported, turning the entire infrastructure into a familiar environment for someone willing to study it deeply, and the killer had done exactly that, learning how delays cascaded, how reroutes created blind spots, how human attention thinned at transition points, and how fatigue shaped behavior, and the victims were selected not because they were weak but because they were expected to be somewhere at a certain time, expected to follow routine, and expectation is exploitable, and as Daniel's network ran simulations, the model evolved again, revealing not just when the next disappearance would occur, but how the killer would adapt if pressure increased, predicting retreat zones, fallback nodes, and cooling off periods, and this predictive capacity terrified Daniel, because it meant the killer's planning horizon extended far beyond the present, possibly years, meaning the assumption had not merely allowed continuation, it had enabled long-term sustainability, and that sustainability transformed the crimes from a spree into a system embedded within public life, and when systems collide the one with fewer moral constraints usually wins, and Daniel understood that time was no longer neutral, that every day of delay improved the killer's odds, and so he took the most dangerous step of all. He documented everything, not for internal review, but for exposure, preparing a comprehensive dossier that showed how each murder aligned with institutional denial, how each missed connection traced back to the same belief, and how the Bureau's insistence on precedent had become a statistical accomplice, and this was not an accusation born of anger but of math, because numbers do not assign blame emotionally, they assign it causally, and causality was clear, and as the dossier grew Daniel realized something else, something deeply unsettling, that the killer's activity slowed whenever internal memos leaked into public discourse, not because of fear, but because the killer was testing reaction time, measuring how long it took for attention to fade, confirming that invisibility returned once outrage exhausted itself. And this meant the killer understood not just law enforcement but society itself, understanding that outrage is temporary, attention is finite, and memory is short, and that knowledge was more powerful than any weapon, because it allowed the murders to persist without escalation, maintaining a low visibility equilibrium, and Daniel saw that if the pattern were revealed fully, publicly, and unmistakably, the killer would be forced to change in ways that exposed him, because systems cannot adapt infinitely without error, and error was the only opening left, but exposing the pattern meant detonating trust, admitting that safety narratives had failed, and that admission would provoke resistance far greater than any killer ever could, because institutions fear humiliation more than threat, and Daniel knew the backlash would be immediate, personal, and career-ending. Yet as he reviewed the names of the dead, he understood that careers were renewable, while lives were not, and that realization stripped fear of its power, leaving only resolve. And so Daniel prepared to release the dossier, not to the press, but to a coalition of state oversight bodies, knowing that fragmented authority could bypass centralized denial, forcing action through multiplicity rather than hierarchy, and in doing so he accepted that he would be seen as a traitor by some, a savior by none, and a disruptor by all. But disruption was the only force capable of breaking an assumption that had calcified into doctrine, and doctrine, once wrong, becomes lethal. And as Daniel sent the final encrypted packet, he understood that the story was no longer about catching a killer, but about whether truth could outrun belief before another Tuesday arrived. The release did not explode the way Daniel imagined. It unfolded slowly, almost politely, which was far more dangerous, because quiet acknowledgement allows denial to mutate instead of collapse, and within days oversight committees requested briefings while leadership issued statements emphasizing cooperation and review, language designed to absorb shock without changing behavior. Yet beneath that surface something shifted, because the killer noticed first, long before any official response. Hardened into policy, and the next Tuesday passed without a disappearance, not because the threat was gone, but because the environment had changed, and change, even subtle change, disrupts optimization, forcing recalibration, and Daniel recognized this pause for what it was, not relief but recalculation, and recalculation meant the killer was under pressure, which created opportunity, and for the first time the pattern felt reactive rather than proactive, a reversal that mattered more than any press conference, and Daniel's network intensified quietly, expanding monitoring across transit maintenance logs, emergency call anomalies, and public schedule deviations, watching for signs of probing behavior, and those signs appeared 2 weeks later in the form of aborted routes, near misses, moments where someone vanished briefly from digital presence then reappeared, suggesting test runs without commitment. And this was the third evolution of the pattern. Experimentation under scrutiny. And experimentation increases error probability, which meant the killer was closer to exposure than ever before, yet institutional response lagged still, bound by process and fear of overreaction, and Daniel realized that even now the assumption had not fully broken, it had merely fractured, with leadership conceding possibility without embracing urgency, because urgency implies past failure. And past failure implies responsibility, and responsibility is the one thing large systems resist most. And so the killer continued to exploit that hesitation, adapting again, shifting focus from transit hubs to transitional spaces between systems, places where oversight blurred, such as park and ride facilities, temporary closures, and event-based reroutes, locations where crowds formed irregularly, confusing predictive models just enough to regain advantage, and Daniel felt the ground slipping, because adaptation favored the offender again, and the window created by exposure was closing, and he understood that patterns are not static truths but conversations between adversaries, each move answered by another, and winning requires forcing the opponent into a move they cannot answer. And to do that Daniel needed leverage stronger than data. He needed inevitability, a condition where the killer's process could no longer function without revealing itself, and that required coordinated disruption across standardized systems, something only federal authority could execute, meaning Daniel had to re-enter the very institution that had failed him, armed now with proof of consequence, not theory, and he requested a closed-session briefing, not to persuade, but to demonstrate, presenting a projection showing that unless immediate, synchronized schedule randomization occurred across targeted corridors, the probability of another disappearance within 30 days exceeded 70%, and this projection was not framed as warning but as liability, because numbers framed as risk too. The public can be debated, but numbers framed as future negligence cannot, and this reframing finally pierced the defensive posture, because it shifted the narrative from whether the pattern existed to whether ignoring it would be indefensible, and in that moment the assumption lost its protective power, replaced by fear of documented failure, and action followed quickly, quietly, and comprehensively, with coordinated disruptions implemented under the guise of infrastructure upgrades, creating unpredictability at scale, and unpredictability is poison to optimization, and the killer reacted immediately, accelerating behavior, compressing timelines, abandoning patience for urgency, and urgency creates mistakes, and those mistakes appeared as overlapping anomalies, too many sensor faults, too many aborted routes, too many near exposures, indicating stress, and Daniel watched the model spike, signaling imminent action, and this time the response was ready, with surveillance restored. Redundantly, patrols deployed invisibly and transit staff briefed without context, creating a net that did not look like a net, and on a Tuesday night that felt no different to the thousands moving through the city, the killer made the wrong adjustment, choosing a fallback location that had been disrupted only partially, believing familiarity still existed, and that belief betrayed him, because partial disruption is worse than full, creating false confidence, and that confidence led him into a space where data and human attention converged, where absence could no longer hide, and when the intervention occurred it was unremarkable, no spectacle, no chase, no headlines, just a quiet stop, a routine question, a moment where process finally outpaced intention, and as the reality settled Daniel did not feel triumph, only exhaustion, because stopping the killer did not erase the cost of the assumption, it merely ended its most visible consequence, leaving behind a deeper question about how many patterns remain unseen, protected by belief, waiting for someone to count what others dismiss, and whether the next Daniel will be listened to sooner, or whether silence will again be mistaken for safety, until absence becomes unbearable once more. The arrest did not bring closure, only clarity, and clarity is often heavier than mystery, because once the killer was in custody the full scope of what had been allowed to happen could no longer be blurred by uncertainty, and as investigators began reconstructing the timeline with unrestricted access, the pattern Daniel had fought to surface expanded further backward than anyone expected, revealing early test runs that had been dismissed as accidents, voluntary disappearances, or data errors, each one reinforcing the same fatal assumption that nothing systematic was occurring, and this retrospective visibility was devastating, because it showed that the killer's confidence had not emerged suddenly but had been cultivated patiently by institutional inertia, and Daniel watched as review panels pored over records with newfound urgency, speaking the language of shock while surrounded by evidence that had always been present, and the contrast between past indifference and present alarm exposed the truth that danger is often tolerated until it becomes undeniable, not because it was invisible, but because acknowledging it was inconvenient, and this realization spread quietly through the ranks, unsettling those who understood what it implied about their own decision-making, and as internal reports circulated, they revealed that multiple analysts had noticed fragments similar to Daniel's but had abandoned them after encountering resistance, not from malice but from discouragement, learning subconsciously that some questions were career-limiting, and this culture of quiet self-censorship had been the killer's greatest ally, far more reliable than any technical skill, because it ensured that even when patterns were glimpsed they were not pursued, allowing optimization to continue unchallenged. And Daniel understood then that the story was not about a singular failure but about an ecosystem that rewarded conformity over curiosity, stability over truth, and that ecosystem existed far beyond the FBI, embedded in any large organization that valued predictability above adaptability, and as the killer's methods were dissected, it became clear that he had anticipated institutional behavior with unsettling accuracy, correctly predicting how long reviews would take, how risk would be framed, how responsibility would diffuse across departments, and how urgency would be deferred until liability became undeniable. And this predictive accuracy transformed him from an outlier into a mirror, reflecting back the weaknesses of the system itself, and that reflection was uncomfortable because it suggested that the killer had not defeated law enforcement through superiority, but through alignment, moving in harmony with bureaucratic rhythm rather than against it, and Daniel felt no satisfaction in this insight. Only a grim understanding that stopping one offender did not neutralize the vulnerability, because the vulnerability was structural, not personal, and structural weaknesses persist unless deliberately redesigned, and redesign requires sustained will, something institutions struggle to maintain once immediate threat subsides, and Daniel saw the signs already: task forces scaling back, emergency measures reclassified as temporary, and language shifting from reform to resilience, a subtle rhetorical retreat that signaled normalization. And normalization is the first step back toward assumption, and assumption, once restored, invites exploitation. Again, and this cycle haunted Daniel, because he knew that without memory, patterns repeat, not identically, but functionally, and the killer's case would eventually be archived, reduced to a closed chapter, studied briefly, then filed away, while the lesson it offered about assumption would fade, because lessons that implicate systems are harder to preserve than those that implicate individuals, and individuals can be imprisoned, while systems persist, and as Daniel was called to testify before oversight committees, he chose his words carefully, not to assign blame but to frame consequence, emphasizing that the assumption had not been a mistake in isolation, but a shortcut, a cognitive efficiency adopted to manage complexity, and that shortcuts become dangerous when reality evolves faster than belief, and this framing resonated more than accusation ever could, because it shifted the narrative from failure to adaptation, offering a path forward that did not require humiliation. Only humility, and humility is easier to accept when it is framed as strength rather than weakness, and for a moment Daniel believed that change might endure, that the infrastructure of analysis might be redesigned to privilege anomaly over comfort, and that cross-jurisdictional patterns would be treated as default questions rather than extraordinary claims. Yet he also understood that vigilance decays without reinforcement, and that memory competes with convenience, and convenience almost always wins, and this tension defined the aftermath. A quiet battle between institutional momentum and the fragile imprint of tragedy, and as Daniel returned to his desk, now elevated but no less isolated, he wondered whether his success had truly altered the system or merely interrupted it, and whether the next pattern would be recognized sooner or dismissed just as efficiently under a different assumption. Because assumptions rarely announce themselves, they feel like common sense, and common sense is the hardest thing to challenge, especially when it has worked before, and as the city moved on, Tuesday nights blending back into routine, Daniel kept counting, not because he expected another disappearance, but because counting was his way of remembering that safety is not a state achieved once, but a process that must be questioned continuously, and that the most dangerous threats are not those that scream for attention, but those that align perfectly with what we already believe to be true, slipping through defenses not by force, but by agreement. The killer's confession, when it finally came, did not reveal madness or grand ideology, only method, and that was the most unsettling part, because method is transferable, teachable, repeatable, and as Daniel read the transcripts he realized the danger had never been confined to one person, but to the logic that enabled him, a logic that treated systems as predictable organisms rather than moral constructs, and the killer spoke calmly about studying reports, audits, and response times, about learning how long it took for concern to travel upward, how often patterns were dismissed as noise, and how disagreement dissolved once enough uncertainty was introduced, and every sentence confirmed what Daniel had feared, that the murders were not acts of passion but proofs of concept, demonstrations of how easily complexity could be turned into cover, and this understanding reframed the case yet again, because it meant the true crime was not just murder, but validation that an Assumption could shield repeated harm indefinitely if no one was willing to confront it directly, and Daniel saw how dangerous that validation was, because it transformed belief into vulnerability, and vulnerability into invitation, and as internal training materials were updated to include the case, Daniel noticed the language soften, focusing on the offender's ingenuity rather than institutional inertia, a subtle reframing that preserved pride while diluting accountability, and this bothered him more than open denial ever had, because dilution erases urgency without appearing to resist it, allowing lessons to fade gradually rather than be rejected outright, and Daniel understood that memory within institutions is fragile, because it competes with incentives, and incentives favor continuity, not disruption, and even now pressures were emerging to move on, to reallocate resources, to treat the case as resolved, yet Daniel knew resolution was an illusion, because the assumption that had enabled the killings was older than the case and more resilient than any reform memo, and he began to see it everywhere, in unrelated investigations where anomalies were deprioritized, in briefings where outliers were dismissed as edge cases, in conversations where consensus mattered more than curiosity, and this recognition carried a quiet dread, because it meant the conditions for repetition already existed, waiting only for someone observant enough and patient enough to exploit them, and Daniel realized that the killer's greatest legacy was not fear, but instruction delivered through consequence, showing exactly where systems bent and where they broke, and that instruction could be learned by anyone willing to study it, and this placed an ethical burden on Daniel that extended beyond his job description, because knowing how harm occurred creates responsibility to prevent its recurrence, even when prevention is unpopular, slow, and politically inconvenient, and he began advocating internally for structural changes that prioritized cross-domain anomaly synthesis, arguing that patterns should be assumed until disproven rather than dismissed until proven, a reversal that challenged decades of practice, and resistance followed immediately, not aggressive, but procedural, requests for pilots, studies, phased implementation, all mechanisms that deferred commitment while appearing cooperative. And Daniel recognized this pattern too, the pattern of delay, masquerading as diligence, and he understood that the same logic that had protected the killer was now protecting the assumption from reform, and this realization hardened his resolve, because he knew now that vigilance was not a moment but a posture, and that posture had to be defended continuously against erosion, and as public interest waned and headlines shifted, Daniel felt the familiar pull of forgetting, the temptation to let normality return, yet every time that temptation surfaced he remembered the early Tuesdays, the silence, the clean reports, the comforting explanations, and the names that had accumulated quietly beneath them, and that memory anchored him, reminding him that the true danger was not ignorance, but confidence, confidence that what had worked before would work again, confidence that patterns announce themselves loudly, confidence that institutions cannot be outpaced by individuals, and confidence, once misplaced, becomes a weapon, and as Daniel looked ahead, he understood that the real fight was no longer against killers, but against certainty, because certainty closes doors that curiosity might otherwise open, and curiosity is the only defense against threats that evolve faster than belief. And so Daniel stayed, not because he believed the system was fixed, but because he believed it was worth challenging again and again, until questioning assumptions became reflex rather than rebellion, knowing that this work would never be finished, never celebrated and rarely rewarded, but that somewhere, on some future Tuesday, absence might fail to occur not because danger was gone, but because someone, somewhere, chose to see a pattern early and refused to look away. Time passed, and with it came distance, the kind that dulls urgency without ever quite erasing consequence, and Daniel noticed how quickly the extraordinary became procedural, how reforms once framed as essential were reclassified as best practices, optional, adaptable, and therefore ignorable, and this shift worried him more than open opposition ever could, because optional vigilance is indistinguishable from neglect once pressure fades, and as months turned into years the case was taught as an anomaly, a rare convergence of intelligence and opportunity, rather than as an inevitability produced by structure. And this narrative was comforting, because anomalies do not demand systemic change, they demand only admiration and cautionary footnotes. And Daniel watched new analysts absorb that framing, nodding at the right moments, learning the lesson that would not threaten their advancement. And he understood then that institutions do not resist truth directly, they absorb it selectively, reshaping it into something survivable, and survivable truths are often toothless. And this realization led Daniel to a quiet conclusion, that the most important work would never be written into policy but into culture, into how questions were asked, how doubt was rewarded or punished, and how often someone was encouraged to pursue a line of inquiry that made others uncomfortable. And culture, unlike policy, changes slowly, through repetition, example, and consequence, and Daniel began focusing his energy there, mentoring younger analysts, not by telling them what to think, but by modeling what persistence looked like, showing them that resistance did not always announce itself as hostility, that it often arrived as politeness, delay, and reassurance, and that learning to recognize those signals mattered as much as any technical skill. And in doing so he realized that the killer's greatest advantage had been emotional, not intellectual, exploiting the human desire for closure, coherence, and calm, desires that institutions amplify because they make governance manageable. And this insight reframed Daniel's understanding of threat entirely, because it suggested that prevention was less about identifying dangerous individuals and more about maintaining discomfort long enough for truth to emerge. And discomfort is expensive, emotionally and politically, which is why it is so often avoided. And as Daniel reflected on this, he saw parallels everywhere, in disasters that had been predicted but not prevented, in warnings that had been filed but not acted upon, in assumptions that had outlived the conditions that once justified them. And this universality made the case heavier, because it meant the story was not unique, it was representative, a single thread in a much larger pattern of how complex systems fail quietly before they fail catastrophically. And Daniel understood that the killer had simply been faster than the institution, exploiting a lag between reality and belief, a lag that exists everywhere humans build systems to manage scale, and scale always outpaces attention, and attention always outpaces memory, and memory always outpaces reform, creating gaps that can be exploited by anyone patient enough to wait. And this understanding reshaped Daniel's sense of success, because stopping one offender did not feel like victory anymore, it felt like interruption, a temporary correction in a much longer trajectory, and that trajectory would continue unless actively bent, and bending it required sustained effort without immediate reward, the kind of effort that rarely survives budget cycles and leadership changes. And Daniel felt the weight of that responsibility settle in quietly, not as burden but as acceptance, because once you see how assumptions function, you cannot pretend they are harmless, and you cannot unknow the cost of ignoring them. And as he continued his work, Daniel stopped measuring progress by arrests or accolades, and began measuring it by something far less visible, by how often an analyst hesitated before dismissing an anomaly, by how often a meeting ended with a question rather than a conclusion, by how often discomfort was tolerated instead of smoothed over. And these moments were small, fragile, and easily reversible, yet they mattered, because they represented cracks in certainty, and cracks are where light enters. And Daniel knew that the future would bring new patterns, different in form but similar in function, and that the only defense would be a willingness to doubt what felt obvious, to challenge what felt settled, and to remember that the most dangerous assumption is not that danger exists, but that it would look the same as it did before. And as long as that lesson lived somewhere in practice, not just in archives. The story would not be over, it would be ongoing, a quiet contest between belief and observation, where the outcome would always depend on whether someone was willing to ask the question that disrupted comfort before absence made the cost undeniable. The years that followed proved how fragile vigilance truly is, because nothing tests commitment like the absence of immediate threat, and Daniel watched as new crises competed for attention, each one louder, more visible, and easier to explain than the quiet mechanics of assumption, and gradually the space for anomaly shrank again, not by decree but by drift, as meetings shortened, priorities shifted, and urgency relocated to problems with clearer narratives, and this drift did not feel like failure, which made it more dangerous, because it carried the comforting illusion that progress had been made and danger neutralized, and Daniel understood now that safety narratives age quickly, becoming stories we tell ourselves to justify standing still, and standing still in a changing environment is functionally the same as moving backward. And this realization was reinforced when Daniel encountered a new dataset years later, unrelated on the surface, involving infrastructure delays and minor discrepancies in emergency response metrics, discrepancies small enough to be dismissed individually but eerily familiar in aggregate, and that familiarity sent a chill through him, because it echoed the earliest signals of the previous case, the same faint irregularities that had once been ignored until absence forced recognition, and Daniel felt the old tension return. The question of whether raising concern would be seen as diligence or disruption, and the fact that this question still existed told him everything he needed to know about how incomplete reform truly was, and as he began tracing the data quietly, cautiously, he realized that history does not repeat exactly, it rhymes, altering details while preserving function, and this emerging pattern did not indicate a killer, not yet, but it indicated opportunity, the kind of opportunity that becomes crime when someone recognizes it and decides to act. And Daniel understood that prevention must occur before intent manifests. Because once intent exists, damage is already underway, and this placed him again at odds with institutional instinct, which prefers reacting to harm rather than anticipating it, because anticipation carries the risk of being wrong, and being wrong publicly is punished more severely than being late privately, and this imbalance incentivizes delay, which assumptions exploit perfectly. And Daniel saw how the cycle perpetuated itself, how each generation inherits not only systems but the unspoken rules that govern them, rules about what questions are safe to ask and which ones quietly end careers, and this inheritance mattered more than any formal training, because it shaped behavior long before logic intervened, and Daniel realized that true reform would require not just new processes but new protections, safeguards for those who challenged consensus, incentives that rewarded early doubt rather than late certainty, and these ideas were difficult to sell because they threatened stability, and stability is prized above all else in complex organizations, even when it conceals risk, and Daniel felt the familiar frustration rise, the sense of pushing against something vast and slow, yet he also felt something else, a tempered patience born not of resignation but of experience, because he knew now that change rarely arrives as revelation, it arrives as accumulation, small pressures applied consistently over time, and he committed himself again to that work, not with the urgency of crisis but with the endurance of understanding, knowing that the real danger was not that another killer might emerge, but that the system might once again be perfectly prepared to miss the early signs, and that preparedness would be invisible, celebrated even, until the cost surfaced, and Daniel refused to let that happen without resistance. Even if resistance took the form of quiet persistence rather than dramatic confrontation, and as he looked at the new data, the subtle irregularities, the faint misalignments, he understood that the story he thought had ended was simply evolving, testing whether the lesson learned had been internalized or merely archived, and the answer to that question would determine whether absence remained an exception or became routine again. Because the true measure of safety is not how we respond when danger is obvious, but how we behave when danger is only a possibility, when acting requires imagination rather than proof, and imagination is the first casualty of assumption, and as long as assumption remains unchallenged, opportunity waits patiently, just as it always has, for someone willing to exploit it. Daniel understood, more clearly than ever, that the story had never been about one killer or even one failure, but about a recurring human shortcut, the instinct to trust what feels established over what feels uncertain, and this instinct, when embedded into systems with power, becomes a force that shapes outcomes long before intent enters the equation, and as he reflected on the years behind him, he saw how the original assumption had not been born from ignorance, but from success, from models that once worked well enough to become doctrine, and doctrine, once formed, resists revision because it carries the weight of past victories, and that weight can crush new information quietly, politely, without ever announcing itself as obstruction, and Daniel realized that this was the most dangerous phase of any system's life, the moment when confidence outpaces reality, when belief lags behind change just enough to create exploitable gaps, and those gaps do not announce themselves with alarms, they present as normalcy, routine, and efficiency, and that is why they persist, and that is why the killer had thrived, because he did not need secrecy, he needed predictability, and predictability is what systems produce best. And as Daniel looked forward, he accepted that no reform would ever be final, no policy immune to erosion, no lesson permanently learned, because systems are living things shaped by incentives, memory, and fear always pushes toward the familiar, even when the familiar is outdated, and this acceptance did not discourage him, it clarified his role, because once you stop believing in permanent solutions, you stop chasing closure and start cultivating awareness, and awareness is not dramatic, it is quiet, persistent, and often unrewarded, but it is the only thing that keeps assumptions from hardening into blind spots. And Daniel began framing his work not as prevention of specific crimes, but as disruption of certainty, encouraging environments where doubt was not treated as weakness, where anomalies were explored before they demanded attention through loss, and where questioning models was seen as maintenance rather than mutiny, and he knew this approach would never eliminate harm entirely, because no system can, but it could reduce the window in which harm operates unseen, and shrinking that window was the true objective, because every delay matters, every early question matters, every refusal to accept convenience over curiosity matters, and as Daniel revisited the original case files one last time, not out of obsession but out of respect, he saw them differently now, not as a tragedy alone, but as a warning written in data, a warning about what happens when belief is allowed to outrun observation, and he understood that the title others would eventually give the story, about how one assumption let a killer continue, was accurate but incomplete. Because the assumption was not singular, it was collective, reinforced daily by small decisions, deferred conversations, and comfortable conclusions, and dismantling it had required not heroism but persistence, not brilliance but refusal to stop counting, refusal to accept silence as safety, refusal to let patterns be dismissed because they were inconvenient. And Daniel knew that this refusal would need to be renewed by others long after he was gone, because assumptions regenerate naturally, like weeds in unattended soil, and vigilance requires cultivation, not once, but continuously, and as he closed the file and returned to his work, he carried with him a simple understanding that would guide every decision going forward, that the most dangerous failures are rarely sudden, they are gradual, built from reasonable choices made repeatedly under the shelter of confidence, and that the true measure of responsibility is not how we act when certainty is high, but how we behave when certainty is absent, when acting requires risk, imagination, and the willingness to be wrong early rather than silent too long, And if there was any hope embedded in the story at all, it was this, that assumptions can be challenged, patterns can be seen, and harm can be interrupted, but only by those willing to accept discomfort as the cost of awareness, and as long as someone, somewhere, is willing to ask whether what everyone believes is still true, the pattern does not get the final word.